Good evening. I'm sorry I haven't been posting up anything for a little while, but I'm afraid circumstances have made it a bit difficult. However, I'd like to start however, this evening there is a topic I'd like to discuss and on this video, and so that's what I shall do. Now, last Sunday there was a report in the Mail on Sunday about a Shia Shaykh Yassir al-Habib who'd attempted to raise £3 million to purchase a Scots island which he intended to turn into an all-Muslim enclave. He planned to set up a hospital, school, a Torsa, which is an Islamic seminary, and also he'd have his private army. The community would be founded for Muslims and would be ruled by Muslim law, by the sharia. Now, he got absolutely nowhere with this. The owner of the island, Torsa, refused to sell it to him. The people of the surrounding islands said that they welcomed everybody, but it all looked a bit suspicious to them. Well, yes it is. I mean, he's actually building what is basically a theocratic enclave, a theocratic state within a state. So no, he won't be allowed to get away with it. From what I understand, private armies have been illegal since Henry VII took over in 1495 or whenever it was, and I think one Scots laird is allowed to keep his own, but that's it. For some reason, the private military contractors are allowed. The mercenary companies, which have been engaged in places like Iraq, assisting with the troops there. And I don't quite know how that works, because I would have assumed they would have come under the legislation, but whatever. No private armies are allowed in Britain. Also, the implementation of Sharia law on a scale he wanted it would never have happened anyway. I mean, it's so much against the British Constitution that, quite frankly, he hasn't hope. As for running schools and hospitals, I think you need a lot more money than just £3 million. Hospitals are not inexpensive. So, that's the background to that. And also, let's be clear, he may have raised £3 million, but he had a broadcasting station which was broadcasting to the world, and I don't think most of the money came from British Muslims. 93% of Muslims, according to polls, have pretty much the same views on these issues as white Brits. No segregation, no Sharia law, or at least not on that scale. When I think they talk about Sharia law, they're talking about family courts and things like marital reconciliation and inheritance. They're not talking about what I presume this fellow wanted to introduce, which is, full criminal punishment and, Sharia law en bloc. Now, the desire for such segregated communities isn't, unfortunately, a new one. I came across it when I was studying Islam back in the 90s, and I found calls for autonomous Muslim communities in some of the material I was reading from that was published by the Muslim presses. They were in several of the books I remember reading by Taha, who are a Muslim publisher. I think one of them may have been in a book on Islamic morals, or it could have been a book on Sharia law. I've forgotten quite which, but it was in one of those two. And they wanted separate Muslim communities governed by Sharia law with Arabic as their language. And if you didn't accept this, well, then you didn't really believe in multiculturalism. That was the attitude. In the Millennium edition of the colour supplement for the Financial Times, that was the weekend of the Millennium, Anjem Choudary, who at the time was running Sharia for Belgium, was featured as one of a number of people being interviewed about what they expected the future to bring, or what they wanted the future to bring. Choudary wanted an autonomous enclave for Muslims in Belgium, governed by Sharia law and with Arabic as the official language. Now, I think you can trace the origins of this separatism right back to the 1920s, and some of the movements which in modern Islamic thought, or Islamist thought, which are very inspired this organisation as Hizb ut-Tahrir. In the 1920s, one of the Indian Muslim leaders published a book called The Guardian of the Pious. He was afraid that Muslims would be absorbed and assimilated into wider Indian society, and that there'd be no difference between Muslims and Hindus. So the book was intended to encourage Muslims to stress their religious and cultural difference by wearing different clothes, observing Islam very precisely, other customs, food, etc., all of it. Now, this attitude is still present, or has been still present over here. About 15-20 years ago, I was rooting around in one of the second-hand bookshops in Bristol's Park Street, and there was a book on Islam published by one of the Muslim publishers up there, which again argued for the establishment of Muslim separatist enclaves. This time it tried to use the example of the British settlement of the North American colonies. According to this book, at the time, Britain didn't have enough colonies of its own to settle our territories, so we allowed other foreign nations to settle within them, provided that they swore allegiance to the crown, but kept their laws, customs, and culture. Now, I think something like that did happen, although obviously you do not have separatist laws and laws in America anymore. You have the law of the individual states and wider federal law. Now, what has been done there is an attempt to justify Muslim separatism using the example of British colonialism, which in my opinion means that the separatist communities they demand are themselves colonialist. I don't think you can get around that, especially not if you were saying, like this fellow was, Yassir al-Habib, that he wanted the area to be settled by Muslims all over, from all over the world. That's colonialism. That's asking for colonists to settle. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I haven't seen any of this discussed by anyone. I mean, you find a lot of discussion online and in the press, naturally, about the problems of Sharia law, and mostly it's from the mainstream press saying that actually most Muslims don't want it, which is quite true. However, from what I've seen, there is absolutely no discussion of Islamic separatism. I'm not sure even that the academics and politicians, who usually talk about race or whatever, are aware of it, or if it is, they've just brushed it away. It's just ignored. It doesn't come in a vacuum, however, since before the Muslims started talking about it, black communities in Britain and America had at one time also made calls for autonomous communities. One of these, I remember, was in the pages, it was attacked and criticised in the pages of The Observer in 1984. They were not impressed at the time by Paul Boateng, who was one of the new black British MPs. He represented one of the constituencies in Bristol, and he made some kind of speech saying we want autonomous communities for blacks. And the Observer at the time said this is apartheid. In the 1970s and 1960s, during the racial unrest in America, there were also calls for autonomous black communities over there. And the Nation of Islam has as one of its aspirations the creation of a white state from some of the American states. Quite how large this would be varies. Sometimes they talked about 5 states, sometimes it was 20. There was another group at the same time who also wanted a separate black American state. This lot were extremely right-wing. They did not. I'm not sure if they believed in democracy or not. I think they certainly didn't believe in anything like the welfare state, and they wanted to ban trade unions. Now, this group, if they were white, would almost certainly have been called fascists. But because they're black, I don't think they were. They were almost certainly called termed radical, and there was almost certainly going to be a lot of opposition to them. But fascists? No. And this is one of the problems I have with these discussions. Separatist communities is apartheid. But in these areas, nobody, except for that, that piece by the Observer in 1984, nobody wants to call it apartheid. Nobody wants to discuss it. And yet, they certainly don't want to call. There is certainly a reluctance to call some of the extremist Islamist preaching, which again, most Muslims in this country don't agree with, fascist. The people, people might condemn it, but I'm afraid I don't see on the left the outrage that would occur if a white person stood up and started promoting clerical fascism. The type of fascism of sections of the Roman Catholic Church in the 1920s and 1930s, where fascism was being promoted as a uniquely Christian movement. There isn't any outrage there. Not comparable. And this, I think, is why I am afraid the left at the moment does not understand. It doesn't understand anti-white racism. It is exclusively focused on white racism against blacks and people of colour for historic reasons. but it means that the rage which we are now seeing at the moment, and which is unfortunately is exploding into riots, comes from people who feel that their own concerns are not understood and they are either being ignored or vilified and just accused of being far right, whatever. I think if there is to be any progress in patching up and returning the country to peace, we need to accept that there are other forms of racism than anti-black, anti-Asianism, anti-Asian or Islamophobia. Thank you.